So we have our next group of speakers, starting with Michael Wells. So Michael works as a project officer with the National Trust of Western Australia. He has degrees in architecture and planning and was the director of the Northern Territory Government's Heritage Branch from 2005 to 2023. Thank you, Michael.
Good morning, everyone. Well, look, the premise of this talk today is that heritage managers sometimes have to deal with places that are significant and that we wish to conserve, but they no longer have a practical use and are potentially in a state of irreversible decline. In other words, a ruin. I put it to you that we've got the Borough Charter, which I think is an incredible document that provides great sort of guidance. The Borough Charter doesn't mention the word ruins, and I put it to you that there are unique and challenging management issues involved in managing ruins, and that this is an issue that is not going away. We don't have unlimited resources to manage all the places we wish to conserve, and sometimes what has been referred to as managed decline is the only option. Okay, so in this presentation, I'm just going to cover the definition of a ruin, point you towards some guidelines which I suspect most of you probably aren't aware of about managing ruins in Australia. I'm going to give you an overseas perspective. I'm going to give you a couple of case studies, and then we're going to change tack towards the end and have a bit of a reflection about what ruins mean from a sort of a cultural point of view. So, who is familiar with this document? 1, 2, 3. Only because I showed it to you, Louis. No, that's instructive. I mean, look, I like to tell people about this document whenever I can because I think it's really under the radar. I mean, the good news is, in terms of what we're discussing today, is that in Australia there is some really good guidance available, and it's this document. It was put together in 2013, and I'd like to give credit to Context Proprietary Limited, who put this together. It was put together by a group called the Heritage Chairs and Officials of Australia and New Zealand. That's a mouthful, isn't it? It offers a useful definition of a ruin, which I think is probably uncontroversial. And it provides a methodology, like it's a really well-structured document, and it encourages you to work through steps which are sort of analogous in many ways to what you would do if you were dealing just with the Borough Charter. The key thing is probably just sort of below the third step down there, where it encourages you at a certain point, after you've assessed significance and reached a certain point, to think about what the future of the place is. And there's a spectrum there. So the spectrum ranges from basically doing nothing and allowing the place to return to nature. And at the other end of the spectrum is actually potentially, if it's possible, effectively restoring or reconstructing the place, if that's possible. Some of the key points in the document are that, as you see there, a place that lacks a use is not necessarily always going to be a ruin. And the document counsels us against the idea that once a place is a ruin, it will always be a ruin. So this, in a sense, is the first thing you need to do when you're looking at what you think is a ruin. Is this always going to be a ruin, or is it possible to bring it back in some way? As per the Borough Charter, everything starts with an assessment of significance. An interesting aspect about ruins, I think, which we'll touch on, is that I think they're sort of unique in this respect, that they often are associated with some sort of disaster. And I've got a case study about that. Managing community expectations is critical. And I think we're up against something here. I don't know about you, but I think there's a sort of a prevailing view in the community that our job is to restore everything to its former glory, And so ruins can be a hard sell. You can be in a difficult situation where you're saying to the community, yep, it's a ruin. And you know what? We're not going to restore it or reconstruct it. We're going to manage it as a ruin. That sort of goes against, I think, what the public think we do. There's some interesting points that the guide makes about interpretation. And basically they're saying you just have to be careful how you manage that, because a ruin has a certain poignancy about it often. Often they're in remote locations. You want to keep that, and you don't want to overwhelm the place with interpretation. But do we want no interpretation? No, we want some interpretation so that people can understand what they're looking at. And documentation is important because before we can sign a ruin to oblivion, we need to choose a point to make sure that we document what's there and that we capture that for posterity. So lessons from overseas. In my research, I found that there seems to be lots of stuff happening in the UK. There might be places elsewhere where they're covering this issue, but it seems like the UK is doing quite a lot. It's a place where, in the UK, there's been much discussion in recent years about what they refer to as managed decline, and they see this in the context of risks associated with climate change and an environment where, as English Heritage has put it, public funding for the built heritage is precarious and unpredictable. In 2021, there was an article published in the Historic Environment in the UK entitled "When Loss is More." That's good, isn't it? I wish I'd thought of it. From managed decline to adaptive release. And that must have had an impact because only a year later, this guidance document was produced, and that is about this process that they refer to as adaptive release. And there's a few key points about that. This is within the guide. And so they're very clear about saying that this is not a pathway to neglect, but it's an active process. It's long-term and iterative. Collaboration is always critical. And identifying the owner and, or if possible, a steward for the place is also potentially critical to the future of the place. And it's not cost-free. To some case studies now. As you heard, I spent quite a few years in Darwin. I worked for the NT Government's Heritage Branch for 20 years, actually. So this is a Darwin example. This is the old town hall. Before 1911, Darwin was actually known as Palmerston. So this was the Palmerston Town Hall, a fine building designed by John George Knight, who was quite a character. He was an advocate of solar bathing, which, as I understand it, was basically just getting nude. So he was an interesting character who did lots of things, including being an accomplished architect, and he designed this building. It was designed in the 1880s when Darwin was going through a boom. Now, that building, people always think of Cyclone Tracy, which was 1974, right? I'm sure you've all heard of it. But there were really big cyclones in Darwin in 1897 and 1937, and Darwin was bombed not once but multiple times during World War II, and this building actually survived it all. But Cyclone Tracy was too much for it. It was almost completely destroyed. But a really interesting decision was made in the aftermath of Cyclone Tracy. There was a huge effort made to get rid of all the debris and to rebuild Darwin. And quite early on, they decided that instead of trying to reconstruct this building or just raze it to the ground, they were just going to keep the ruins as they were. And as you can see, they've been stabilised. And so now it's taken on a life of its own as a sort of a reminder of Cyclone Tracy in a city where you could go and visit today and you could spend a week in Darwin looking at all the sites, and actually you wouldn't see anything that reminds you in the way that this does of Cyclone Tracy. It's very reminiscent of the incredible destructive power of Tracy. So it's now got that role. So I would argue that it has special value as a ruin and should be retained as a ruin, even though there have been suggestions in recent years about it being reconstructed. And there are public interest outcomes being achieved here. I mean, this isn't in a remote area. People pass by all the time. It's actually quite popular as a venue. Just one thing about the process of managing ruins. The picture on the top right is how it looked a few years ago, and it very much looks like a ruin, doesn't it? But there were problems with it. The rain was just falling onto those exposed walls and causing all sorts of problems. There was plants growing over it, and it was getting sort of out of kilter. So we spent a considerable amount of money straightening things up and putting a sort of a cap over the top of the stone so that the water wouldn't get in, which was essential because, after all, it doesn't have a roof anymore, right? So we did all that work and were quite happy with it, but we had one person saying, "Oh, it doesn't look so much like a ruin now." So that just goes to show you that you can't win. All right, another quick example. I mean, I made the point early on that sometimes you can look at reconstruction. I would suggest in rare circumstances, where you've got the evidence that you need and the resources, and often those two things, those stars don't often align, right? I was in Nepal in October, and I was struck by how much people talked about the 2015 earthquake, and you could still see lots of evidence of the destruction caused by that earthquake, which was widespread. This temple in Bhaktapur, that's what it looked like not long after the earthquake, and that's what it looked like on my visit. I mean, I think it's just mind-boggling how much effort went into that, and I assume, they wouldn't have been using the Bharat Charter, but I assume as per those sort of principles, they would have made sure that they had the evidence that they needed to reconstruct that accurately before they embarked on that process. So this is possible. Something closer to home now, the Poole Street Bridge. I don't know whether any of you have seen that. You probably haven't because it's a little bit out of the way. Sian's seen it. She's read the guide. So it's just upstream from here. It's on the State Heritage Register. It's the only major river crossing bridge that was built for the Goldfields Water Supply Scheme, and it's a rare example in WA of a structure designed to be both a pipeline bridge and a footbridge. It's a landmark. It's associated with the use of Northam as a migrant centre in the 1950s. So there's no questioning its significance, but there are a few issues. I think, in fact, you could say that it's sort of emblematic of the issues associated with managing ruins. There's no single owner. The northern part is owned by the Shire of Northam. The area banded in red that you can see on the image there is Crown land, but it's managed by the National Trust, so that's where we come in under a management order. And the southern part is on unallocated Crown land. So a recent review by the Trust of our assets confirmed that it's in very poor condition and unsafe, as you see. That seems fairly obvious. Now, what are our options here? I mean, so far, I hate to say it, but it's been doing nothing. I mean, that's what we're doing at the moment. We are actually doing nothing. I mean, we should be doing something, but we're not. And doing nothing will inevitably result, I think, in the collapse of the structure. And it's not clear what implications that may have. And now, one of the things I learnt from my UK colleagues was when they're looking at ruins, if they've decided that this is going to be a process of managed decline, then they try and map that out. They try and predict what perhaps that's going to look like. So it seems to me that if we're forced to consider this as something that is going to go into managed decline, that we could start thinking about that. I mean, what's going to happen first? Are the columns going to go first? Well, what's that going to mean? What will that affect? I mean, if that starts to collapse, will water bank up behind it, or will those bits and pieces go downstream? Is that going to cause any problems? We haven't thought about any of these things, and that's a whole process. But I guess I'm just saying that's the type of approach you have to apply in a situation like this. So look, I'm just going to reflect for a moment on the hold that ruins have over us. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I go to a ruin, it just affects me in a different way to seeing a complete building. I mean, I'm not sure really what it is about ruins. I mean, I think part of it is the mystery. So you can compare a ruin to, a building that's been conserved within an inch of its life and everything's there for you to see and there's lots of information. But with ruins, there's missing information. They make us ask questions that we don't necessarily ask when we look at well-preserved places, like, what was this place? Who lived here? Why is it a ruin? I mean, certainly poets and writers and artists over the years have been fascinated by ruins and the idea of loss. So Browning, in his poem Love Among the Ruins, talked about two lovers meeting at a ruin where a multitude of men breathed joy and woe long ago. And Shelley, in his famous poem Ozymandias, talked about finding a colossal wreck in the desert. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away, he wrote. And then Longfellow wrote about castles in Spain and said he described them as having flowers that hide the rents of time. Emily Dickinson noted that crumbling is not an instant's act. Bruce Springsteen wrote about a city that was dear to him in New Jersey, and he lamented what was happening to the city, saying, "The church door's thrown open, I can hear the organ song, but the congregation's gone." And I bet you didn't think that Susie and the Banshees was going to come into today's talk. But believe it or not, she wrote a song, or the group wrote a song about Pompeii. And she said, "Your city lies in dust, my friend." So look, I think that's interesting that creative people over a very long time are sort of so taken by ruins. And I think it sort of tells us something about how they are different from other sort of types of cultural heritage. I wonder whether there's something else to it. And sometimes I've thought that it's captured by the words of George Harrison, who said that all things must pass. And I think there is something about ruins that make us reflect on impermanence and perhaps our own mortality. And this is something, dare I suggest, that we do not like to discuss, not usually. But I think if there's a lesson to learn, well, how did that come up? There's one more slide. That's okay. I'll just speak over it. There's another slide again. That's okay. So look, this is something we don't like to discuss, and I think my take on this is that if there's a lesson to learn from all of this, I think it might be that it really doesn't help to be in denial in these situations. I mean, I think Elizabeth Kubler-Ross ran us through this, didn't she, with the sort of stages of grief, and it starts with denial and ends in acceptance. And her point is, you've got to get past denial. So we need to face up to the fact, I think, that loss is part of life. And then when we are managing the slow decline of a place, just as when we are dealing with the loss of someone close to us, it is important to remember that along with the grief and the sense of loss, there are opportunities for reflection and learning and growth. Thank you. That's all.
Any questions for Michael? None on the Q&A at the moment. So any from the floor? I'll give you first. Questions. So we've got one.
Yep. Thanks, Michael. That was great. So just wondering for the imminent collapse of ruins, so there should be, I guess, emergency sort of management implications through the owners to, with the what if the bridge collapses. So is there any sort of emergency, like a DFS type arrangement with state government from that point of view, or do they just sort of not worry about it?
I don't know about that. I don't know where the state government would come into it. I mean, I'm sure probably one department or another would have a view. I mean, in a case like this, it would be the department there would be more than one department perhaps that would be responsible perhaps for the river and aspects of good river management. So I'm not sure, but I think you've just pointed to something which is public safety, and that is important. I mean, this with the Poole Street Bridge, it's been blocked off. That doesn't mean that people couldn't access it, and I think there's potentially at least an issue with safety. So that's something that we have to consider, and it's one of those issues that comes up with ruins far more often than it does in other types of cultural heritage, where ruins are often in remote locations, and by their nature, they're potentially unstable and dangerous. And so you have to think, well, how are we going to manage that? Oh, yes.
I was just curious about how many ruins the National Trust manages. Are there prominent ones that we all know about but don't realize that the National Trust is managing?
Well, we've got an incredibly diverse range of places. I mean, we've got 65 places throughout WA. Most of them are in the category of built heritage, and most of them are sort of usable buildings. The Poole Street Bridge was the one that stood out for me, sort of head and shoulders, because it was once a functioning structure. That hasn't been the case for a very long time. Somehow we've ended up with it. And it seems like it's just sort of crying out for us and the other owners, which I presume the department would come into it. If it's unallocated Crown land, which you don't see very often, so I don't know who's responsible for that, but we might be knocking on your door perhaps. And then there's the Shire of Northam. I mean, we have to get together and talk about this because I think it's one of these things about risk management, isn't it? The people who don't understand risk management think if you do nothing, then somehow that's the best thing to do and you can't be criticised. Well, no, I don't agree with that at all. Sometimes doing nothing brings with it more risks than doing something. So in this case, I think we should be doing something.
That was great. Thank you. Do you think there's a difference between something that's become a ruin through gradual decay over time compared to something that's been impacted, like the Cyclone Tracy example, and that overnight becomes a ruin?
Yeah, I think there is because I've been reading up about this, as you can imagine, and one of the papers I read said it started off with something like ruins by definition are a result of neglect, and I was like, well, I beg to differ, I mean, the town hall in Darwin, that is not the case. I think when there's been a catastrophic event that has caused the place to be a ruin, then I think to me that makes it more interesting because then you've got a connection with the event, and that's exactly what's happened in Darwin, and that's why the town hall is so powerful now because, as I said, it's the only place that you could go to the museum and see the Cyclone Tracy display, but short of that, you could wander around the whole city of Darwin and not even be aware that Cyclone Tracy happened, let alone see some sort of poignant reminder of its destructive power, which is what that offers us. Good.
So the categories of owners of ruins, Michael, because we've got in the Poole Street Bridge, we've got multiple owners, but they're all or authorities, I suppose. We've got local government, we've got state government, and whoever. I'm just thinking about private ownership. If so, a lot of private owners have been known to just let things go to ruin, demolition by neglect, to actually achieve their aim of actually having a heritage property that's on their land just decay, so they can do something else. So I'm just wondering about the responsibilities of, say, local government, who don't really have the resources to maintain ruins, and in terms of the attitudes, I suppose, of the owners of the land on which the ruins are, or even the sea, because there are shipwrecks around as well. What are there different attitudes between different owners of land, and how can we convince them that ruins are important?
Well, there's a whole lot of things there. I mean, we have to be very wary of demolition by neglect. And I think we also need to be wary of some sort of private owner who sees a presentation like this and goes, oh, managed decline, that sounds good, compared to sort of other things that they might do. And they might think that that's a sort of a sneaky way of getting out of their obligations. So I think we need to avoid that. But then there's a whole series of questions that are raised by what you've said too about how you would manage a ruin on private land as opposed to on public land. It's more problematic on public land in some ways, I think, because you've got the public liability issues. If it's publicly accessible, then that's at the top of your mind. If it's on private land, perhaps you don't have that, but there might be other issues about trying to make sure that it's managed properly.
Okay, thanks. Just to answer the question also about the National Trust ruins. So there's two areas with the masonry buildings that are ruins. It's the telegraph station at Israelite Bay. It's a fairly substantial stone building that remains, but certainly a ruin. And also up at Central Grenfell, we've got a number that would come under how you'd categorise as ruins.
Yep.
But I do have a question about interpretation and the message we tell people about these ruins.
Yeah, well, look, that's tricky. I think it's one of the trickiest aspects of it because it goes to that issue that I mentioned at the beginning, which is that I think people somehow expect all of us to be sort of restoring everything, and they don't think that it's our job to allow things to fall into decline. So that can be a hard sell. But let's just say we looked at the Poole Street Bridge and we decided that managed decline was the only option. Well, my contention would be that we need to be frank about that. And even if people are like, well, that's ridiculous. What does the National Trust think they're doing? Aren't they supposed to be preserving places? I think you just have to ride that out and explain to people slowly and carefully that, there's lots of places to conserve and we don't have the resources to conserve them all. And sometimes it doesn't even make sense. Like if you look at the Poole Street Bridge, I think I'd be right in saying, if you look at all the options under the borough charter, I mean, I think arguably you could restore it, but actually it'd end up like grandfather's axe, wouldn't it? You'd be replacing this member and then that member and then probably every single member until you sort of had a facsimile of the Poole Street Bridge rather than the original bridge. So, yeah, these are all things to think about. Yeah. Does this lady still have a question? I think she's been, no. Okay.
It was very interesting, and I was also just thinking how I believe the Japanese method is more restoration and having everything perfect rather than allowing it to be declined. Is that
Well,
correct?
that's so interesting you say that. I don't actually know that much about this, but I do understand that in China, for example, it's been said that in Australia we're a bit obsessed with original fabric. It's like, no, you can't touch that. That's original fabric. We've got to conserve the original fabric at all costs, which is fine. But I think there's a difference between original fabric and meaning, and meaning can mean different things to different people. So as I understand it, for example, there's I think it's the Imperial Palace in Beijing. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong. But, it looks exactly like it did in, 1400 or something. But there's no single part of it which dates back to 1400 because, as I understand it, there's just a sort of a way of looking at things there where they don't have any qualms about saying, well, all those columns need to be replaced, so we'll replace those columns. And the roof tiles need replacing, so we'll replace the roof tiles, which is, I think, a bit different to the way we think about things.
There aren't a lot of places that here in Perth that seem to be sort of conserved as a ruin. So, like, I was involved with looking at the Davluck ruins in the city of Coburn, which is part of the Azalea Lay. So the Azalea Lay homestead is not a ruin, but the original people that occupied it, Davluck House, and the whole suite of buildings that used to go through there. Davluck House was it didn't fall down because of neglect. It fell down due to a bushfire that went through there, and so it was just left. And so my recommendation was, well, you need to, like the Northern Territory former house there, was you need to then, if you want to conserve this, then you need to start thinking about conservation of not letting the weather in and things like that. And I think I did that conservation plan about 8 years ago now, and apparently nothing has been done. It's sort of like, this is for here in Perth at any rate. It all seems to be too hard about what do you do with a ruin. And we'll get to that later. But, in the meantime, it still tends to be crumbling. And
And I
that one
think-
was a really good one because being an archaeologist, because it burnt, you've got that fantastic layer of stuff underneath all the collapsed material. So
Yeah, well, it's a pity that people aren't able to recognise, I guess, that ruins are just sort of part of our cultural landscape, and that actually there's something about ruins that, as I've sort of tried to suggest, and it's all just part of the mix, I think. And I think our job is to say to people, there's a huge diverse range of sort of cultural heritage places, and some of them are ruins.
I think the concept of a managed ruin of a property that's in public ownership is a bit different to a property that's in private ownership. And I've got a particular place in mind, but I'm not going to mention it because I might get in trouble. But it's in private ownership. So if the expectation, and it's on the state register, for a private person to have to maintain a ruin that's on private property, and it means that they can't use that property to its full extent because there's this pile of rocks on it, or bricks. That might be more confronting, I think. Because it's, and I know it's on the state register and everything, but and it is being managed. But I think there would be a lot more questions from people around having to maintain a ruin on private property where the property then can't be used for its better use. I think, not saying I agree with that, but I think that might be a question that's raised.
Yeah, well, that's a tension we have, isn't it, with cultural heritage conservation is, there'd be people saying, well, this should be conserved, and other people saying, yeah, but I could use that for something else. But just on a quick note, I mean, I gather from my reading of the thinking in the UK that this idea of adaptive release, which is a very interesting sort of word, I'm not absolutely sure, but I suppose in a country where there's a lot more sort of demand for land and people live more closely together and so on, I think part of that idea seems, I think, to embody the idea that in due course at some point, whatever was there is going to be gone, and then we're actually going to use that site for something completely different. So that's an interesting idea too. It might be in the very long term, but I think that's part of what's embodied in the concept of adaptive release.